The next movie we're going to be discussing is Invasion of Astro Monster, otherwise known in Japan as literally Kaiju Daisenso, which translates to Giant Monster War. It was released in the United States as Monster Zero alongside a movie called War of the Gargantuas, which I'll be covering probably in the next edition of Toho Toku Theater, or Toku Theater as a whole. So, Invasion of the Astro Monster is the next movie in the Godzilla franchise, although Godzilla isn't really the main character. He is the protagonist of the film, if you want to call it that, but he's not the main character. So, this film reunites the epic trio. You know who I'm talking about. Eiji Tsuburaya, Eiichiro Honda, and Akira Ifukube all returned. I mean, these guys shaped the Showa era and really shaped what Godzilla would become forever with their contributions. And as expected, this movie really continues on to that trajectory. So this is following up the Ghidorah film, where King Ghidorah was first introduced. And King Ghidorah is reintroduced here in Invasion of the Astro Monster, or Invasion of Astro Monster. But it's done with a twist. So one thing I'll say about this movie is that it is quite wacky, but it's also dated in a way. But it's dated in a charming kind of way. So this movie came out in 1965. And the other big thing in this film that was prevalent in the West in the 60s is the, of course, original Star Trek series. This movie borrows a lot from that. The plot of this movie, though, in comparison to other movies in the genre, I think is a really creative one, and it's one that's been recycled in the future, but I think this was the first one to really, sort of start this kind of, this plot line. So basically what happens is, we find out, the movie starts out with these, astronauts in space, right? And they're trying to investigate this planet called Planet X. It's a new planet discovered in the galaxy. And they end up meeting an alien race. And the alien race needs the Earth's help because they are being attacked by a creature called Monster Zero. Now, one of the things I loved about the Easter egg in Godzilla King of the Monsters, the 2019 film, is that they do refer to King Ghidorah as Monster Zero. That was awesome. I loved it. So Monster Zero is this monster that's attacking them, and what they do is they plead with the with the world, to borrow the Earth legend monsters, Godzilla and Rodan, monsters that the Earth is known about, who have previously defeated King Ghidorah with the help of Mothra. And they want to borrow these monsters to help them fight once again. Now, Mothra is not in this film. They don't need Mothra. So, the story of this movie is that they want to borrow Godzilla and Rodan, and in exchange, they want to give them the cure for cancer, which in the English dub, they change it to it can cure any disease, which is a lot more interesting for sure, but it can cure cancer. So, basically, as the film progresses, they're trying to figure out whether or not they should even do this. And then there's this sort of issue with, can we really trust these creatures? So, of course, as expected, they do come to Earth because they're worried. The main characters here are worried about, what's really going on. Now, I want to say the film does star one American actor and one Japanese one. Nick Adams plays Glenn, and Akira Takarada plays Kazuo Fuji. Those are the two main characters of the story. And Glenn, besides the fact that he looks just like Vladimir Putin, which is kind of funny to me, it's once again, it's an American actor dubbed in a Japanese voice, and it doesn't really fit the lips. I mean, it is what it is. Get used to it. It's not really a big deal. So what ends up happening is we find out that they were indeed right in that they couldn't trust these aliens because the aliens managed to take control of Godzilla and Rodan, take control of all three monsters. They find out that the aliens were actually in control of King Ghidorah and sets them out to basically attack the Earth, with the idea being that when they wipe out the Earth's population, the aliens can come and take over the planet and eventually add it to their empire once everybody's dead. So that's pretty much what happens. So there's a couple of different monster fights in this film, one in the middle, one at the end of the film, with Rodan, Godzilla, and Ghidorah. The fights are fine. They were a lot of fun. And this begins to really take shape with this movie, where we saw Toho getting slowly more and more lazy because of, and why do I say that? Because of the fact that there's a ton of stock footage that was used from this movie in future films. I mean, a ton of stock footage. And I know I haven't gotten to review those yet, but I know it's used. Ifukube's soundtrack, he takes the that classic Godzilla marching theme for the opening credits, and I love the way he remixes it here. That's one of my favorite themes, or maybe my favorite Godzilla theme. I mean, I love it. And we see, of course, new work from him that I think is phenomenal for this series. Now, earlier in the review, I brought up the cheesiness. I brought up, and comparing it to Star Trek 60s, and it really is like that. The aliens in this, are obviously all Japanese people in extravagant costumes. The sound effects are straight up almost borrowed from Star Trek. It's got that old-timey, cheesy kind of feel to it with the way people dress, the way they behaved, even in Japan. Without question, it is a cheesy romp, but it's a fun romp. I like the story here. I like this idea that they want to trust the aliens, but they're not really sure what their motives are. I like that the aliens actually are able to one-up them, and I do like how in this movie, the humans are actually the ones to kind of be ingenious enough to fix their own problem. They managed to create this way to interrupt the alien signal to regain control of, or at least break the control of the monsters from the alien, civilization, or whatever you want to call it, ship. So the humans actually do participate in a positive way here, and in a way that made them useful. So the human story in this film is hard to really ignore, and it's a good one, because I feel like in a lot of these other films, the human story does feel a bit shoehorned in, like they give it too much time, or it's not that interesting. I've complained about that in previous movies. They didn't really capture my attention, whereas here, I think it worked out well. I think it does tend to drag a bit, I won't lie about that, but it does, the mystery of the aliens and what their purpose is something that kind of keeps the first act going. It does slow down a bit in the second act, but then the third act picks up relatively well, so I have to say it is a very good movie. Now, some are going to complain that, well, it's rehashing a similar story from before. We've already seen Ghidorah as the villain. We've already seen Godzilla as the protagonist, right? That's how it's been for the previous film and this one. And I think that's fine, because what you're doing is you're not really rehashing the original story, because the story is different because of the human element. No, I think with this movie, what you're doing is you're sort of creating a precedent, and you're creating a rivalry. Now, if it wasn't for this film and the previous film, I don't think people would view Ghidorah as being Godzilla's greatest foe. It's like they bring him back as the main villain, and now Godzilla, who had previously been a villain in many of the previous films, now is slowly kind of going into that role of being the main protagonist, the main babyface. And so because of that, I think that doing this establishes tradition. Now, did that break away from the tradition? A couple times it did, but in the future. But this became the ongoing rivalry that would continue into almost every subsequent Godzilla era. The Heisei era continued it. Obviously the Millennium era continued it, and even the American version, the Legendary Pictures, Ghidorah is the main villain of Godzilla, King of the Monsters. So again, like, this really, really hammered home that tradition. But this movie also introduced the alien aspect, which is something we'd see time and time again in future Godzilla films, not to mention the whole alien mind control thing. This was the first film to really take Big G and put him in space, extend beyond the Earth. And I like that. Like, I really like that. And it should be respected for all the things it did. Yeah, it borrowed from Ghidorah being the previous villain, but it made sense because Ghidorah was obviously a big deal. I mean, that film, the Ghidorah film that preceded this one, made a ton of money. So why not, kind of from a business perspective and from the perspective of expanding the Godzilla lore, why not bring in Ghidorah back in a different light and continued the story that way, also with Aliens. I thought it was a really smart business move, and they brought back all the right players to make it work. This movie also intelligently had that woven love story between the human and the alien, you know, and that was pretty well done. And really, I think it was pulled off really well by Nick Adams. I think that they brought him in for some Western flair, for that Bond type of flair. I always compare these to Bond films, and the comparison is definitely one that is appropriate, I feel like, for what they were going for with this movie, because it was co-produced with an American studio. And besides that, the special effects, I think, are once again a step up. I think Eiji Tsuburaya did a really good job with the monster suits here. I think the miniatures look better. I think you see him getting better and better here. And it's crazy because the work he did on the original Gojira from '54, you know, at this point, it's over 10 years, 11 years. And this guy has reinvented himself and taken the genre to new heights based on how he was creative enough to come up with new ways of really showing the size and scope of these monsters and having it look authentic. I should also mention, because I mentioned stock footage earlier, this movie does use a little tiny bit of stock footage, a little bit. But it's not, it's like from the Mothra movie, but it's barely noticeable. I mean, you have to really look for it to really see it. I didn't see it on my first view. It took subsequent viewings and doing research to really see it. And I went back and I was like, yeah, there it is. It's definitely there, but it's, again, so small. Later on, we'd have this be totally overdone and in a very shallow way. This was a very easy movie for me to watch, and I'm not sure if it's because of the fact that I personally love 60s cheesy sci-fi, and my brother introduced me to a lot of old Star Trek stuff like that, or if it's because I'm obviously from the West, so I've been indoctrinated with Western, you know, cinema, Western films, way before I discovered the Eastern films, and thus having that balance kind of made it easier for me. I do wonder how somebody from Japan, raised in Japan, who went to go see this movie feels about it. Obviously, it did very well at the box office, but I do wonder, you know, if culturally that is different for those overseas. Either way, you're going to get Godzilla, you're going to get Ghidorah, you're going to get Rodan, they're going to duke it out, and although some of the movie is silly, it's still a really good film and has some of the better special effects of the entire Showa era. I mean, it's great. So that is the last thought, my final thoughts on Invasion of Astro Monster Giant Monster War. Up next, I'm going to be doing War of the Gargantuas and Ebiran Horror of the Deep, which is actually the next Godzilla entry. So we will talk to you guys in that video. Take care.